it's just stagnating. We're still going back.
Right.
Whereas if we can get these amazing skills out there to the people who need them, just imagine what could change. Oh, so, sorry, it's a hobby horse. I've forgotten what the question was as well.
Well, I was just interested in listening. But,
you can tell that I spend most of my working life listening, because as soon as you give me the carte blanche to talk, off I go.
It's all that pent-up frustration. You just go for it. So, just talking about something else. I mean, the issue of metaphors, and you've released some products regarding that. One question is, what are we beginning to find out about metaphors and how they affect our lives? What's some of the research that you found on this?
Well, metaphor is pretty much it's my other hobby horse, but it's been my hobby horse for a lot longer, because metaphor has been part of my life since I was a teenager. So it's I've been sort of in there since my dad was researching it when I was a teenager. So I've been au fait with the research really since there's been a field around the role of metaphor in thought.
Okay.
And what people are discovering now is that it used to be thought, and a lot of the NLP trainings that you'll get treat metaphor in the same way that Aristotle treated metaphor. That metaphor was something that a speaker comes up with in order to influence the unconscious mind of the listener. What's now understood is that metaphor is absolutely central to the way that people process information. So it's the stuff of thought. It is how we think at both a conscious and unconscious level. And the reason that we use metaphors in our language is because we use metaphors in our thought. So we actually use something like, depending which research you look at, between 6 and 9 metaphors per minute in ordinary English.
Wow. That's a lot.
It's a great many. And of course most of them you don't even notice.
No.
You know, if you're clocking all those metaphors, you'd never have any attention left for what the person was actually saying. But the metaphors that we use in our language are not only influencing other people's thoughts in the same way that Aristotle aimed to influence people's thoughts with metaphor, but the metaphors in our language are symptomatic of the metaphors in our thoughts, unconsciously and consciously, and the metaphors in our thoughts influence our behaviour.
Okay.
So, for example, we think of important things as big. So there's a metaphor in our thinking. Big is like important. So all a metaphor is thinking of one kind of thing in terms of another kind of thing.
Yeah.
So big is like important. Important is a metaphor for big. Now the influence that has on our behaviour is that whenever we think of something, whenever we see something big, we assume that it's important. And that
It gets
works.
categorised as that as well then.
Yes, it gets categorised as important. So you'll get interesting results like the fact that chief executives of companies are likely to be significantly taller than members of their boards.
Right.
Or you'll get things like, if you give someone a heavy clipboard, they'll think your research is more important than if you give them a light clipboard.
That's interesting.
Or if you...
But completely out of our awareness.
Absolutely out of your awareness. You don't... Somebody gives you a clipboard, you don't think, right, how heavy is this clipboard? That must mean this guy's important. It just happens naturally.
Yeah.
And if there are 6 metaphors a minute in our language, just think how many metaphors there are in our thinking.
Okay.
Most of them completely outside our awareness.
So I imagine when you have someone that's that you're coaching, and they see something as, you know, really big in regards to their development, or in regards to their future progression. They put a lot of emotion on it because they see it as important.
Yes, so it's not particularly common way that I would work with it, but David Grove, who's the guy who invented clean language, used to talk about things being strangely scaled. So when things were a problem, it felt like things were out of proper scale. And in his work, he thought that one of the ways he could tell when a particular piece of work with a client had been successful was when the scale returned to normal.
Okay.
So when this imaginary big person changed to being ordinary sized. So he played with this for quite a long time and experimented with the impact of that, and he firmly believed that a restoration to ordinary human scale was an indicator of mental health. I'm not sure I would go so far. I'm not a psychotherapist. He was.
Yeah.
And so I'll do many other things. But, I think that's an indicative of the kinds of things you can do with this information.
And you have a product called Discover the Secrets of Intelligent Influence. So if we use the use of metaphor influencing, what can a person gain from understanding that, the use of metaphor?
Well, I think paying attention to metaphor.
Oh, you're cutting out again. Sorry, it's out again. Are you there?
As it goes. And there's a whole other level to it, which is that people's metaphors in their unconscious minds are incredibly different from each other. We share these sort of common cultural metaphors like important things are big, but actually when you get into the nitty-gritty detail of how one particular person is representing the world metaphorically, it will be very, very different to the next person. So specifically how big means how important will be unique to each individual.
Right.
And the language that they use in describing their metaphoric experience inside their minds will be unique to that individual. And actually if you can develop the skill to use a person's own metaphors back to them, you'll have a much greater level of influence with them than if you introduce a new metaphor from the outside. And when you are influencing people using their own metaphors, you'll get people saying things like, it's as if you really understand me, you really get me, you really get where I'm coming from. And this ties back to the first thing we were talking about. If you can convince a potential client that you really, really understand them, specifically what your potential solution is almost beside the point. The job of marketing, the job of selling is already 90% done once they believe that you understand them. And metaphor can be an incredibly powerful way of doing that.
By recognizing the metaphors that they're using and then use those metaphors back on themselves.
Yeah, exactly.
Brilliant. And the product that you use goes into that. Is that right?
Yeah. So I've got a couple of video products out at the moment. There's Intelligent Influence, which pretty much gives an overview of what I've described with quite a lot more depth to it. But it's talking about the complete process, all of what I've just said, and some specific techniques for how to at each stage. The newest project I'm working on, I've called it The Mind Reader's Guide to Metaphor.
Nice.
And it's going to be, because there is so much richness in all this stuff, I'm going to do a series of videos on this. But the first one is about actually, how do you hear those metaphors that people are using? Because typically we don't notice them. So what specifically do you need to be paying attention to in order to start to hear them when you're not hearing them? So that's that's my newest video product. It's called Hearing Hidden Metaphors, and it also goes into more about this important is big and some of these other common cultural metaphors as well.
Okay, so without giving too much away, how did you kind of learn? What kind of things did you do for skill development in regards to listening to those metaphors?
The key thing, well, it comes back to listening. And there are some specific techniques that you can use to improve your listening ability. And the main thing is to start to regard listening as important. Because most people, whenever they're having a conversation with somebody,